I stared at the flickering hologram of the alien fleet, their ships like obsidian whales hanging in the thermosphere, and felt the cold weight of history pressing against my ribs. The Council had called it Operation Mnemosyne, a plan that relied not on missiles or lasers but on the oldest weapons humanity had forged: guilt, shame, and the labyrinthine threads of international law that had bound empires for centuries. My role was to curate the narrative, to splice together the darkest chapters of our past into a signal the Armada could not ignore. A psychic net woven from the screams of slaves, the echo of Nuremberg tribunals, and the silent treaties that never saw ink. The aliens communicated in patterns of light and gravity, a language we had only begun to decipher after years of listening to their probes drift through the Kuiper Belt. Their society, we learned, was a hive of consensus, each individual's actions filtered through a collective memory that punished deviation with swift exile. If we could make them believe that humanity itself was a chronic violator of the very covenants they revered, if we could convince them that Earth was a planet condemned by its own statutes, they might hesitate, debate, even withdraw rather than risk contaminating their purity with our corruption. I spent the last 72 hours in the underground vault beneath Geneva, where the original charters of the United Nations lay sealed alongside the confiscated dossiers of war criminals, colonial administrators, and tyrants whose names had been erased from schoolbooks but never from the archives. With a team of linguists, historians, and rogue lawyers, I reconstructed a montage. Excerpts from the transcripts of the Tokyo trials, the testimonies of survivors from the Armenian genocide, the clandestine cables detailing the Sykes-Picot betrayal, the internal memos showing how the Treaty of Versailles sowed the seeds of another world war. Each fragment was stripped of context, rendered into pure emotional resonance: fear, outrage, the visceral sense of injustice that had driven humans to both atrocity and redemption. We then encoded those fragments into a series of low-frequency pulses, mimicking the harmonic patterns the Armada used for their own collective deliberations. The idea was simple: bombard their decision-making nodes with a cascade of human guilt so dense that their consensus algorithm would overload, forcing a recursive loop of self-examination. In effect, we hoped to make them question whether they, too, carried the shadows of conquest within their own collective psyche, a question no alien civilization had ever been compelled to ask itself. The first transmission went out at 03:14 UTC, a thin beam aimed at the lead dreadnought's communication array. For 12 heart minutes nothing happened. Then the alien ships shuddered, not from impact but from an internal ripple. Their hulls flickered as if adjusting to a new frequency. I watched the readouts spike, anomalies in their synchronization protocols, a rise in error rates that suggested their consensus was fracturing. A junior analyst whispered, "They're arguing." I could almost hear the phantom debate, accusations of hypocrisy, pleas for mercy, the unsettling realization that the very moral framework they used to judge others could be turned back on them. Hours bled into a tense stalemate. The Armada hung in orbit, immobile, their weapons powered down as their internal discourse consumed bandwidth. Back on Earth, governments that had been poised to launch preemptive strikes found themselves holding their breath, uncertain whether to celebrate or fear the precedent we were setting. I felt the paradox tighten around my chest. We had saved the planet not by out-fighting them but by out-remembering ourselves. A soft chime broke the silence, the signal that the alien lead ship had begun transmitting a response. Their language, still alien, now carried a modulation that resembled a question rather than a command. I leaned closer, the weight of every atrocity we had laid bare pressing against my temples, and prepared to draft the next layer of our trap. A legal brief, written in the syntax of their own jurisprudence, accusing them of crimes against the very sentience they claimed to uphold. The battle would be fought in courtrooms of thought, and I, the reluctant archivist of humanity's darkest hour, was ready to present the case. I drafted the brief with trembling precision, every clause a blade honed from centuries of human jurisprudence. We had studied their legal canon for months, dissecting the alien equivalent of precedent, appeals, and arbitration. Now I stitched together our indictment: genocide by omission, cultural erasure through assimilation, the silent theft of planetary resources under the guise of stewardship. Each charge mirrored the darkest chapters of our own history, but inverted, refracted through their own statutes until the accusations became undeniable. The transmission was not a weapon in the traditional sense, it was a summons, a demand that the Armada convene a tribunal to judge itself. I knew the irony was deliberate. Humanity, once dragged before its own courts for crimes against humanity, now forcing an alien empire to confront the same mirror. Their reply came in fragments, hesitant, as though their collective mind was splintering under the weight of contradiction. They asked for clarification, demanded evidence. We gave them everything: archives of Nuremberg, transcripts of truth commissions, the bureaucratic machinery of guilt catalogued in endless detail. We did not hide our shame, we weaponized it. Soon the Armada's ships began to drift apart, not in retreat but in quarantine. Each vessel isolated itself as if afraid contamination might spread. Their consensus algorithm had collapsed into litigation, every ship a defendant, every commander a witness. I realized then that we had not beaten them, we had infected them with the one disease they had never encountered, doubt codified into law. On Earth, the silence was unbearable. No missiles fired, no armies marched, only the quiet hum of servers processing centuries of human atrocity into alien jurisprudence. I felt the weight of it pressing down, the knowledge that our victory was not clean, not noble, but parasitic. We had turned our darkest histories into a virus, and now we waited to see if the Armada would survive the trial we had forced upon them. And in that waiting I understood the true terror. If they learned to endure it, if they found a way to reconcile guilt with power, then they would return not as conquerors but as judges. The silence stretched like a taut wire, each second humming with the weight of unresolved judgment. I sat in the dim glow of the archive vault, the servers blinking steadily as they fed the Armada's legal subsystems with endless streams of human testimony, transcripts from the International Criminal Court, the whispered confessions of apartheid tribunals, the meticulous ledgers of colonial exploitation. Every byte was a mirror, every reflection a potential fracture in their collective certainty. A soft chime broke the reverie, a priority flag from the deep space relay. I hesitated before opening it, knowing that any reply would either seal their fate or give them the foothold they needed to turn the virus back on us. The message was terse, composed in their flowing glyphic syntax, translated by our linguists into stark English. We request an audience, designate a neutral arbiter, we seek understanding, not condemnation. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The protocol we had drafted demanded that any alien request for dialogue be filtered through a council of human historians, ethicists, and former war crimes prosecutors, bodies we had resurrected from mothballed institutions precisely for this moment. Yet the Armada's plea felt less like a surrender and more like a probe, a test of whether our legalistic contagion had left them vulnerable to manipulation. I summoned Dr. Lion Joe, the lead jurist who had helped us alienate their statutes, and together we drafted a response that mirrored their own procedural language. We would convene a tribunal on the Lunar Gateway, a place neither side could claim as sovereign territory, under the auspices of the Unified Earth Legal Accord, a treaty we had never ratified but now invoked as a neutral framework. We stipulated that the proceedings would be recorded, transcribed, and made available to all of humanity, turning their potential acquittal into a public spectacle that would expose any lingering hubris. The reply came faster this time, tinged with an unfamiliar note, perhaps relief, perhaps calculation. They accepted the lunar venue, proposing a panel of 3 of their own senior adjudicators alongside 3 of ours. The condition was stark: the tribunal would not determine guilt or innocence, it would merely seek clarification of the charges, allowing the Armada to present mitigating evidence rooted in their own cultural imperatives. As the details settled, a cold realization settled in my chest. We had weaponized our shame, yes, but we had also handed them a stage upon which to perform redemption. If they could frame their actions as tragic necessities, orders given to preserve a greater cosmic order, sacrifices made to avert a greater entropy, they might emerge not as condemned criminals but as misunderstood stewards, their narrative polished by the very jurisprudence we had unleashed. I walked to the observation deck overlooking the silent cityscape, the sky a bruised violet where the first of the Armada's distant hulls lingered like wary sentinels. Below, the streets were empty. The usual bustle of commerce and protest had been replaced by a vigilant hush, as if the planet itself held its breath, waiting to see whether the virus we had loosed would mutate into a cure or a cancer. A soft vibration at my wrist signaled an incoming personal channel, an encrypted line from an unexpected source. It was Captain Vrel of the Armada's diplomatic corvette, the one vessel that had refused to quarantine, its crew reportedly debating the merits of joining the tribunal rather than fleeing it. Her voice, filtered through the translator, was low and urgent. "Archivist, we have found something in your archives that unsettles us. A record of a trial where the accused were acquitted despite overwhelming evidence, not because they were innocent, but because the law itself was deemed unjust. We wish to discuss this precedent. Can we meet?" I felt the old archivist's instinct flare, curiosity tempered by caution. The alien Armada was learning to read between the lines of our legal texts, to seek loopholes not just in their own codes but in ours. If they could cite our own failures of justice as a shield, they might turn our weapon into a paradox, a law that condemns its own enforcers. I replied, agreeing to a private vid link, and prepared myself for the conversation that would decide whether our darkest histories would remain a chain around their necks, or become the key that unlocked a new kind of conquest, one fought not with fleets but with the seductive promise of absolution. Captain Vrel's image flickered into existence, her features caught between alien austerity and something almost human in their unease. She wasted no time with pleasantries. "Your tribunal is a labyrinth," she said, her voice taut. "We thought we understood its walls, but now we see doors that lead nowhere, corridors that fold back upon themselves. This precedent you call jury nullification, it terrifies us. It suggests that law is not a fortress but a theater, and the actors may improvise." I leaned forward, aware that every syllable mattered. "You're beginning to grasp the paradox we live with daily. Our laws are not immutable, they are mirrors, sometimes cracked, sometimes fogged. Justice here is not a destination, it's a negotiation, and that negotiation can be weaponized." Her eyes narrowed, the translator struggling to capture the nuance of her tone. "Weaponized against us, against anyone who steps into the arena," I replied. "You sought a tribunal to clarify charges, but clarification in our system is never sterile. It breeds interpretation, and interpretation breeds doubt. If you invoke our precedents, you risk binding yourselves to them. And once bound, you may find the very absolution you seek is indistinguishable from condemnation." She paused, and I could almost hear the gears of her mind grinding against the unfamiliar machinery of human jurisprudence. "You mean," she said slowly, "that even if we prove necessity, even if we show our actions preserved order, the tribunal may still decide that necessity itself is a crime?" I nodded. "Exactly, our darkest histories are full of leaders who claimed necessity. They were acquitted sometimes, but history judged them differently. The tribunal is not the end, it is the beginning of a narrative you cannot control." Her silence stretched, heavy as the violet sky outside my window. Then she spoke, softer now, almost reverent. "You have turned your own failures into traps. Every acquittal, every miscarriage of justice, every loophole, these are snares waiting for us to step into them." I allowed myself a thin smile. "That was the plan, we don't need to fire a shot, we only need to let you argue yourselves into the same contradictions that have haunted us for centuries. You wanted to understand humanity's darkest histories, now you must live inside them." Her image flickered, and for the first time I saw fear, not of our weapons, but of our words. She ended the transmission abruptly, leaving me alone with the echo of her realization. Outside, the Armada's hulls seemed to drift further back, as if the weight of our archives had pushed them away. And I knew then, the tribunal was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about survival in a theater where the script was written in shame and the stage itself was a trap. The screen went black before I could even set down the file I'd been holding, the sharp plastic corner digging a half-moon into my palm. My throat was dry, caked with the stale dregs of the coffee I'd chugged at 4 a.m. 3 days prior when the Armada first broadcast their demand for a formal interstellar tribunal, and I fumbled for the dented ceramic mug on my desk to wash the grit down. The comms panel lit up before my fingers even brushed the handle, 3 blaring pings stacking on top of each other. The lead tribunal clerk, the head of our deep cover espionage team embedded in the Armada's lower engineering deck, and the alien liaison's second in command, the one we'd been feeding carefully curated half-truths to for 6 months. I tapped the liaison's ping first, his hexagonal face filling the screen, twitching with a panic I'd spent weeks cultivating. "Your motion to recuse the tribunal is invalid," he blurted before I could even speak, his translator spitting out the words a half-second too fast. "Your procedural rules require any recusal motion to be accompanied by sworn affidavits from every member of your delegation attesting you have never excluded a juror for prior public statements about a case. If we comply, we admit our entire legal system operates on bias. If we do not comply, the motion is dismissed and the tribunal proceeds as scheduled." I leaned back in my creaking office chair, the edges of the Polaroid of my grandma, civil rights lawyer, spent 12 years fighting housing discrimination in the 60s, always said the law was a hammer if you held it right, brushing my elbow. The faint drift of the Armada's hulls away from the planet, visible through my window, had been the first sign our ploy was sticking, the first hint they'd realized the tribunal wasn't the formality they'd expected. "That's correct," I said, keeping my voice level. "You asked for our legal system to adjudicate your claims. Our system runs on precedent. You can't pick the parts you like and discard the parts that inconvenience you." He sputtered, the translator glitching for a second as he switched to his species' higher register of speech, the kind used for formal protest. "We will appeal to the Galactic Federation. Your tribunal has no standing under Interstellar." I cut him off, tapping a key that pulled up the fake Federation charter we'd doctored 6 months prior, full of clauses about respecting indigenous legal systems that we'd fed to his team in small pieces over weeks of back-channel communication. The Federation recognizes the right of any sovereign species to adjudicate disputes within its own territory using its own legal frameworks. You declared Earth a disputed territory when you entered our orbit. This tribunal is operating under our framework as per Federation Statute 721. If you appeal, you admit you do not recognize Federation law, which makes you a rogue actor subject to immediate sanctions. We've already broadcast the preliminary hearing notice to every Federation outpost within 40 light years. They're watching. His face went still, the faint violet glow of his bioluminescence dimming for half a second before he cut the transmission without another word. I switched to the deep cover agent's ping next. His face was grainy, shot from a maintenance closet on the Armada's third deck, grease smudged on his cheek, his voice low enough that I had to turn my volume all the way up to hear him. Command is split. The hardliners want to glass the planet, say the tribunal is a stalling tactic. The legal corps is terrified. They say if you attack while the tribunal is in session, every Federation species will see you as tyrants who reject rule of law. Also, you remember that dead man switch we said we had, the one that broadcasts all of humanity's worst atrocities if the Armada fires? I nodded, though he couldn't see me. We'd never actually built the switch. We just broadcast a fake encrypted signal when we first announced the tribunal, one that looked exactly like the Federation's emergency alert network, and fed the Armada's intelligence teams enough fake data to make them believe we had it hardwired to every archive server on the planet, triggered by any weapon discharge above a certain yield. Sensors picked up a burst transmission from your fake switch an hour ago, he said, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Command thinks it was a test. They're convening a vote in 2 hours. If the hardliners win, they're going to fire a warning shot at your comms array first, see if the switch triggers. I thanked him and cut the line, then pulled up the tribunal clerk's file. She'd already uploaded the alien delegation's initial filing to the secure server, and the response our legal team had drafted was sitting in the queue, ready to be served the second the tribunal opened. It was 412 pages long, citing 27 contradictory human legal precedents. The Nuremberg Tribunal's rejection of the just following order's defense, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda's ruling that state necessity does not excuse genocide, the U.S. Supreme Court's Korematsu decision that justified Japanese internment as a matter of military necessity before being formally repudiated 80 years later. The Salem witch trial's reliance on spectral evidence that was later ruled entirely inadmissible. Every precedent came with a footnote linking to the full unredacted archive of the atrocities associated with it. The 11 million killed in the Holocaust, the 800,000 murdered in the Rwandan genocide, the 120,000 Japanese Americans locked in camps, the 20 people executed in Salem after being tortured into false confessions. We didn't plan to win the tribunal. We never did. The point was to make them argue through every single one of our darkest moments, to make them tie themselves in knots trying to claim their invasion was a necessary act to preserve galactic order, only to have every argument they made land them in a contradiction with their own supposed commitment to justice. We wanted them to spend so much time tangled in our legal and moral failures that they'd forget we were even here, that we were the ones who had set the trap. All those centuries of tyrants hiding behind necessity, all those judges who sold out for a promotion, all those juries that let murderers walk free because they liked the defendant's smile, none of it was wasted. We'd just been saving it for this. The comms pinged again, the alien liaison's face back on the screen, his expression tighter than before, the edges of his mandibles clenched so hard I could see the white of his inner skin. We withdraw our motion to recuse. We accept the tribunal's jurisdiction on the condition that all proceedings are sealed, and no evidence of our internal deliberations is shared with the Federation. I smiled, the same thin smile I'd given him an hour earlier. Sealed proceedings are fine, but all evidence submitted to the tribunal becomes part of the public record under Federation law. You know that? He stared at me for a long moment, the translator whirring as he tried to find a loophole, a way out of the knot we'd tied for him. Outside the window, the Armada's largest capital ship drifted another 100 meters back, its engines dimming to a faint pulse. Somewhere on that ship, a vote was happening. Somewhere, a commander was looking at the list of precedents we'd already leaked to their internal comms, seeing the same patterns of failure and hypocrisy that had haunted humanity for thousands of years. Realizing that stepping into our tribunal meant stepping into a maze with no exit, every turn marked with the bones of the people we'd wronged. We will submit our opening statement tomorrow, he said finally, his voice hollow, stripped of all the arrogance he'd carried when he first arrived in orbit demanding our surrender. And we will prove our actions were necessary. I have no doubt you will, I said, leaning forward to pull up the draft of the fake Federation sanctions we'd written, ready to release the second they filed their opening statement. Just make sure you bring your precedents. We have plenty of hours to counter them. He cut the transmission again, and I glanced back at the photo of my grandma, the one where she was standing outside the courthouse after she won the housing discrimination case, grinning like she'd just won the world. For the first time, I understood what she'd meant when she'd said the law wasn't about justice. It was about power, and for the first time in human history, we weren't the ones on the receiving end of it. The screen flickered to black before I could even exhale. The alien liaison's jagged mandible still burned into my retina. I leaned back in the creaking tribunal chair, the worn leather of the armrests dug into my elbows, and let my gaze drift to the photo of my grandma taped to the edge of the console, her courthouse grin bright enough to cut through the dim hum of the server banks lining the UN chamber walls. For 5 years I'd thought she was naive, that her stupid faith in the system was just the coping mechanism of a woman who'd spent 40 years fighting losing battles for tenants getting evicted and kids funneled into adult prisons. I'd been the one who was naive. Comms are secure, Leela said without looking up from her keyboard, her fingers flying over the keys so fast I could barely see them. She'd spent 18 months undercover as a salvage trader on the edge of the Kuiper Belt, running supply runs to the alien scouting ships before the Armada arrived, planting the modified legal codexes on their hard drives bit by bit. They've already started circulating the opening statement guidelines we leaked last week. Half their junior legal officers are arguing they should just surrender the Sol system and leave before we even convene the first session. I tapped the console to pull up the live feed of the Armada's internal comms. The encrypted stream Leela had hacked 3 days after the first alien ship dropped out of FTL above New York. The feed was a mess of chirping alien dialects, the translator software spitting out snippets as we filtered for command channels. Precedent 17b, Colonial Occupation Liability Automatic Asset Forfeiture, Nuremberg Standard, Command Responsibility for Civilian Casualties. If we refuse jurisdiction, the Federation freezes our drive cores for 200 standard years. Every single one of those precedents was either a fake we'd cooked up, or a real human atrocity we'd rebranded as binding interstellar law. The 1945 Tokyo trials, the 1994 Rwandan genocide denial rulings, the 2027 U.S. Supreme Court decision that let oil companies off the hook for poisoning half the Gulf Coast. We'd spent 2 years digging through the rot of our own history, picking the most brutal, inconsistent, power-serving rulings we could find, and feeding them to the aliens as the unshakable foundation of interstellar justice. They thought we were handing them a fair fight. They didn't realize we were handing them a meat grinder built out of our own worst mistakes. The sleeper team on the flagship just confirmed, Marco said from the other side of the room, the ex-Hague war crimes prosecutor leaning back in his chair, a half-empty coffee mug in his hand that had a sticker of the ICC logo on it, faded from 10 years of use. He'd spent 15 years defending genocidal dictators, knew exactly how to tie a defendant up in procedural knots so tight they'd suffocate before they ever got to present a defense. The Command Council is split 3-2 right now. The 2 hardliners are still pushing to glass the planet, but the other 3 are pointing out that our leaked precedent on unprovoked attack on a non-aligned civilization carries a mandatory 300-year trade embargo, plus reparations equal to 70% of their fleet's value. They're calculating how many of their crew would starve before they made it back to their home space if that happens. I pulled up the draft of the Federation sanctions we'd forged, the document we released the second the aliens filed their opening statement denying all wrongdoing. It looked perfect, right down to the holographic seal of the Galactic Federation Trade Commission. The language pulled verbatim from the actual sanctions levied against the pirate clans that raided the outer colonies last century. If they thought the tribunal was bad, the sanctions would be worse. Every FTL drive in their fleet would be remotely disabled, every supply cache they'd stashed in the outer system would be seized, every transmission they tried to send to their homeworld would be jammed by the relay satellites we'd quietly put in place over the last 6 months. They'd be trapped here not as conquerors but as castaways forced to live under our laws, our rules, our mercy. No shots fired, no ships blown up. Just paper and precedent and the weight of every unjust thing humanity had ever done to itself, turned back against the people who thought they could waltz in and take it all for free. The comms pinged again, a priority alert from the alien liaison, his face back on the screen before I could even accept the call, his usually chitinous gray face streaked with a blue fluid I assumed was the equivalent of sweat. "We have a counter-proposal," he said, the translator's voice flat, stripped of all the venom it had held an hour earlier. "We will cede all claim to the Sol system, withdraw our fleet to the edge of the heliosphere, and provide full reparations for the damage our scouting ships caused to your lunar infrastructure, if you drop the tribunal proceedings entirely. I felt the smile tug at the corner of my mouth, the same one Grandma had worn when she got the settlement check from the city after she won the housing case, the one that said she knew exactly how much they were lying, exactly how much they were scared. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the console, and let the silence stretch for a full 10 seconds, just long enough for him to see that I wasn't buying it. "That's a generous offer," I said, and I could see his mandibles clench again like he knew what was coming. "But under Federation law, any settlement of this nature requires formal adjudication of liability first, which means the tribunal still has to convene. We'll add your offer to the record, of course. Make sure the jury sees how reasonable you're being." I nodded at Leela, who tapped a key, and the feed of the Armada's internal comms popped up on the big screen behind me, the translation running across the bottom for the liaison to see. Half his command staff were yelling, the other half were already pulling up the procedural rules for pleading guilty to avoid trial, the same rules we'd slipped into their codex under the heading of Federation Mandatory Dispute Resolution. "You set this up," he hissed, the translator glitching a little on the static. "You knew we'd make this offer, you planned this." "Of course we did," I said, and I tapped the photo of Grandma, the one where she was holding up the eviction notice she'd just gotten thrown out of court for, grinning like she'd already won. "You think we spent thousands of years writing down all our stupid, cruel, self-serving rules just to let some armada of invaders come in and take what they wanted without paying the price? We didn't save all that for nothing. Now you get to play by our rules, all of them." He cut the feed again, and I leaned back, listening to the hum of the servers, the quiet chatter of the legal team going over the counteroffer, the distant thrum of the alien capital ship's engines dimming even further like it was already giving up. Somewhere out there in the cold of space, a fleet of conquerors was realizing that the weapons they'd spent centuries building, plasma cannons, FTL drives, armored hulls, were useless against a trap made of paper and precedent, and the unshakable, unending weight of every stupid, cruel thing humanity had ever done to itself, weaponized at last. Leela leaned over, handing me a printed copy of the amended tribunal schedule, the first line of which read, "In the matter of the Sol system v. the Zytheran Armada, case number 2874 Alpha." I ran my finger over the case number, the same number Grandma had tattooed on her wrist, the one she said was the case number of the first housing discrimination suit she ever lost, the one that made her realize the law wasn't fair, but it was the only weapon she had. "First hearing is tomorrow at 900 UTC, Leela said, grinning. "We've got 12 hours to slip the amended discovery requests into their comms. I've already drafted the request for their full command logs, including all footage of the civilian massacres they committed on the Proxima Centauri colonies. They can't refuse, or we hit them with the contempt precedent we cooked up from the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre cover-up trial. Judge Miller already agreed to rule in our favor if they do." I took the schedule, tucking it into the folder next to Grandma's photo. Outside the window, the first stars of dawn were peeking over the horizon, painting the sky pale pink, the alien capital ship a dark smudge against the light, its engines so quiet now I could barely hear them. For the first time in human history, we weren't the ones begging for mercy from a judge who'd already decided we were guilty. We were the ones holding the gavel. "Let's get to work," I said, and opened the folder to the first page of the fake discovery requests. The first page of the trap we'd spent 18 months building, no guns, no bombs, just the worst parts of us turned into the best weapon we'd ever had. I slid the stack of papers across the table, each page a minefield of precedent, citations, and procedural traps. The aliens had no idea what they were walking into. They thought law was a human ritual, a quaint distraction from real power. But law was a labyrinth, and once you stepped inside, every turn led deeper into a place where strength meant nothing and patience meant everything. We had centuries of cruelty codified into rules, and now those rules were the bars of their cage. The comms crackled again, an alien envoy demanding clarification. Their voice was metallic, strained like someone trying to breathe underwater. "We do not recognize your tribunal," it said. Leela smirked, already drafting the contempt motion. "That's fine," she whispered. "You don't have to recognize it. Recognition isn't a requirement, participation is." She slid the motion into the queue, citing the Nuremberg precedent, the one that said even those who denied the court's legitimacy were still bound by its rulings. The envoy's silence afterward was louder than any plasma cannon. I thought of Grandma again, her hands trembling as she told me how she lost her case, how she learned that the law wasn't about justice, it was about endurance. She said the trick was never to win outright, but to make the other side bleed time, bleed resources, bleed hope. That was what we were doing now, turning every massacre, every atrocity, every arrogant dismissal into a procedural delay that stretched into eternity. The aliens had come to conquer, but now they were trapped in hearings, depositions, appeals, each one dragging them deeper into a swamp they couldn't shoot their way out of. The capital ship loomed outside, engines nearly silent, its lights flickering like a dying star. I imagined their commanders pacing, furious, unable to fire a single shot without violating a stay order we'd slipped into the docket. Every move they made was already illegal, every silence incriminating. They were warriors, but here they were defendants, and defendants had no weapons except compliance. I leaned forward, pen in hand, and signed the next motion. It wasn't a missile, but it might as well have been. Somewhere in that ship, a commander would read it, realize the implications, and feel the walls closing in. Humanity had finally found a battlefield where we couldn't lose because it was built from our darkest histories, and we knew every corner of it by heart. The next morning, the tribunal chamber was packed with silence. The aliens had sent another envoy, this one draped in ceremonial armor that shimmered like liquid metal. They thought intimidation could bend the rules, but intimidation was just another entry in the record. I watched as the clerk logged their arrival, noting the delay, the breach of protocol, the failure to submit the required disclosures. Every misstep was ammunition, and we didn't even have to fire it, just file it. They tried to argue jurisdiction again, their translator stuttering through words that had no equivalent in our language. Leela leaned back, eyes gleaming, and whispered to me, "They don't understand that jurisdiction isn't a wall, it's a net. Once you're caught, every thrash just tangles you deeper." She slid another motion forward, this one citing obscure maritime law from the 18th century, a case about pirates who claimed sovereignty. The precedent was brutal, sovereignty meant nothing when crimes were universal. The envoy's armor dimmed, as if the weight of centuries pressed down on them. I remembered the stories of gulags, of endless interrogations where the point wasn't truth but exhaustion. That was the weapon we wielded now. Every hearing was another sleepless night for them, every deposition another reminder that they were trapped in a system designed to grind down even the strongest. They had come expecting resistance in the form of armies, but what they faced instead was bureaucracy sharpened into a blade. The capital ship's lights flickered again, and I imagined the commanders inside, drowning in paperwork translated into their language, each clause a puzzle they couldn't solve. They had no lawyers, no historians, no archivists to guide them. We had all of that and more. We had the scars of our own darkest histories, and we knew how to weaponize them. For every atrocity they had committed, we had a precedent waiting. For every denial, we had a motion ready. For every silence, we had contempt charges lined up like dominoes. I signed another order, this one freezing their supply lines under the guise of asset seizure. It was just ink on paper, but it meant their ships couldn't move without violating the tribunal's authority. They were warriors stranded in a battlefield where the only weapon was patience, and patience was ours in abundance. I felt the tide turning, not with explosions or fire, but with the slow, inevitable suffocation of a system they could neither escape nor destroy. The quill's plastic tip scratched against the parchment as I set my signature at the bottom of the asset seizure order, the faint smell of old paper and burnt coffee hanging thick in the tribunal chamber. The envoy across from me made a guttural, grinding sound, their translator spitting out fragmented threats of orbital bombardment and planetary cleansing before the clerk cut them off, tapping a dog-eared copy of the 1928 Kellogg Briand packed open on the desk. Its pages crinkled at the section outlawing aggressive war. "That statement will be added to the record as a formal admission of intent to commit crimes against humanity," the clerk said, voice flat, no trace of the fear I knew half the staff was tamping down. Leela snickered beside me, flipping open a folder of grainy footage pulled from their first landing, 17 unarmed farmers gunned down in the Peruvian Andes, their bodies left in the fields for 3 days. "Funny," she murmured, loud enough for the envoy's retinue to hear. "Y'all came here yammering about civilizing the galaxy, and the first thing you did is commit the exact same war crimes the Nuremberg tribunal hung men for 70 years ago. Precedent's a bitch, huh?" One of the envoy's aides lunged forward, clawed fingers scraping the edge of the oak table, and the bailiff, Javi, who'd spent a decade filing habeas corpus petitions for detained immigrants before the invasion, stepped in fast, slamming the metal butt of his baton into the floor to block them. "Disruption of tribunal proceedings carries a fine of 2.1 million credits per minute of delay," he said, tapping the tablet in his other hand where the frozen asset ledger glowed, their entire supply convoy stuck in low Earth orbit with no way to move without violating the seizure order. "We've already logged 3 minutes of your little tantrum. That's 6.3 million credits seized. Want to keep going?" The envoy's ceremonial armor dimmed, the liquid metal shifting to a dull mottled charcoal, and I thought of the stories my grandma used to tell me, of the Khmer Rouge officers who made her fill out 3 separate forms every day just to get a bowl of rice, who used paperwork to starve 2 million people without ever getting their hands dirty. She sat me down when I was 12 after I'd skipped school to join a climate protest and said the people who hurt the world don't always use guns, sometimes they use clipboards. So you learn to use a clipboard better than they do. I'd spent the last 10 years doing exactly that, digging through the archives of every colonial tribunal, every genocide trial, every bureaucratic trap humans had ever invented to grind each other down. We found the obscure 1890s salvage law that let us claim their entire fleet as abandoned property when they failed to file the required entry declaration for Earth's sovereign airspace within the 72-hour window. We pulled the 1949 Geneva Convention clauses holding occupying forces responsible for every act of violence committed by their troops, even if commanders claimed they didn't order it, and cited their own failed attempts to invoke the 1884 Berlin Conference as proof they didn't understand the very legal frameworks they were trying to steal to justify their invasion. Every dark corner of human history was a weapon now. Every cruel loophole we'd ever invented turned back on the people who'd come to exploit us. Leela's earlier motion had cited 18th century pirate sovereignty law, but the one we'd slipped into their pre-hearing briefing packet last week was a forged ruling from the International Court of Justice that said any species that committed genocide during first contact automatically forfeited all claim to sovereign territory anywhere in the solar system, planted there by Mara, who'd spent 3 years undercover in their lunar diplomatic outpost, feeding them fake legal codes and falsified precedent until they thought the ruling was real. The envoy tried to speak again, their translator glitching this time, words coming out half-formed and panicked, and Leela slid another motion across the table, this one citing the 1971 Bangladesh War Crimes Act that held occupying forces liable for every civilian death caused by their presence, even if they claimed the deaths were collateral damage. Command responsibility, she said, tapping the page where we'd listed every single one of their confirmed war crimes, 347 counts and counting. Your troops killed 17 people in Brazil last month. That's 347 counts total, each carrying a mandatory life sentence under our tribunal's statutes. We're not just freezing your ships. We're going to extradite every single one of your commanders to stand trial, and we're going to use every single delay tactic we can think of to make that take 50 years if we have to. You think your soldiers are going to keep fighting for you when they find out they're going to spend the rest of their lives in a maximum security prison on Mars, waiting for a trial that never ends? The envoy stood up so fast their chair scraped back, and for a second I thought they were going to lunge, but they just stared at us, their multi-lensed eyes flicking over the stacks of files piled on the table, the half-empty mugs of coffee that had been sitting there for 12 hours straight, the printed copies of every human atrocity we dug up from the archives. They knew we weren't going to fire a single shot. We were just going to bury them in paper, in history, in every single cruel thing humans had ever done to each other, sharpened into a blade they couldn't parry. Mara the clerk cleared her throat, picking up the next stack of motions, the small scar on her jaw from her extraction mission still faint under her conservative blouse. We'll recess for 15 minutes, she said, not looking up from her papers. The defense is welcome to review the new contempt charges we've added for their earlier threat of planetary bombardment. If they'd like to file a motion to dismiss, they have 48 hours. The filing fee is 10,000 credits, non-refundable regardless of the outcome. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing the ache behind my eyes, and thought of my grandma again. She died 2 years before the aliens showed up, but I knew she'd be laughing right now. We'd spent thousands of years inventing ways to hurt each other with words on paper, and now we finally got to use all that cruelty for something good. The aliens thought they were coming to fight an army. They didn't realize they were walking into a graveyard of every bad idea humanity had ever had, and we were the ones holding the shovels. On the other side of the room, the envoy's lead advisor slumped back into their seat, head in their hands, as one of our paralegals slid a new file across the table to them. The full, unredacted records of the Soviet Gulag forced labor system, paired with a motion proposing we classify their entire crew as forced labor assets to offset the damages their invasion had caused. The advisor didn't even look up. They just nodded once, short and sharp, like they'd already given up. I almost felt bad for them, until I remembered the footage of the Peruvian farmers, the burned villages in Nigeria, the refugee camps in Jordan full of people who'd lost everything to their liberation. We weren't being cruel. We were just being human in the worst, most effective way we knew how. The lights in the chamber flickered just for a second, and I knew it was their ship up in orbit, testing our defenses, looking for a weakness. There was no weakness to find. We built this trap out of every mistake, every tragedy, every cruel rule humans had ever written down, and it was holding. Somewhere in the dark of space, their fleet was running out of fuel, out of food, out of hope, waiting for a rescue that would never come because we'd tied their hands with paper. No shots fired, no bodies blown up, just ink and precedent and the long, slow weight of history pressing down on them until they had no choice but to surrender. Leela leaned over, nudging my arm with a fresh mug of tea, and grinned. "Told you jurisdiction was a net," she whispered. I took a sip, the bitter warmth spreading down my throat, and smiled back. The tide wasn't just turning. It had already crashed over them, and they were too busy drowning in paperwork to even notice. I smiled back at Leela, the bitter tea still warm on my tongue, when the lead envoy's voice cut through the low hum of the chamber's air recyclers, flat and stripped of all the bluster they'd carried in 3 days prior. "We accept the jurisdiction of your court," he said, the translator's synthetic cadence slower than usual, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized in the dark while his crew starved in orbit. "All charges are admitted. We surrender." Javi, the paralegal to my right who'd pulled 3 all-nighters combing through 20th century colonial legal archives for this exact moment, didn't even look up from his laptop. He just slid another thick manila folder across the table before the envoy could even lift his clawed hand to sign the admission form. The cover page was stamped with the faded seal of the 1884 Berlin Conference, the same document European powers had used to carve up Africa and assign guardianship over entire populations of people they deemed uncivilized. "While we appreciate your willingness to cooperate," Javi said, tone so dry it could have sanded wood, "we've also filed a motion to classify all 12,000 non-combatant crew members aboard your fleet as wards of the terrestrial court per 19th century colonial guardianship statutes. That gives us full legal authority to dictate your food rations, your movement, your access to all communications, and if you violate any term of your surrender, we can petition for permanent termination of your custodial rights, which would seize your entire crew as indentured labor to pay off the 2.3 trillion credits in invasion damages we calculated last week." The envoy's bioluminescent neck ridges, which our xenologists had told us flared bright when they were angry, dimmed to a faint, sickly gray. He stared at the folder like it was a live grenade. Somewhere in the back of my head I heard my grandma cackling, the way she used to when she'd trap a predatory lender in a loop of their own fine print, telling me, "Honey, the only thing scarier than a man with a gun is a bureaucrat with a library card and a grudge." The lights flickered again, harsher this time, and I knew their command ship in low Earth orbit was throwing a fit. They tried to move their fleet twice in the last 12 hours, only to have our non-lethal EMP buoys, deployed under Admiralty law as navigation hazards for vessels operating in international waters without proper filing, fry their thrusters mid-burn. We'd tied their hands so tight with paper they couldn't even swat a fly without violating some 18th century maritime statute we dug up last minute. The envoy's advisor, the one who'd nodded at the gulag motion earlier, leaned forward, his voice cracking for the first time. "You can't do this. We have a fleet. We have weapons." Leela, who'd been quiet up until then, leaned forward too, tapping the stack of motions on the table in front of her. The full archive of the 1994 Rwandan Genocide Tribunal, the 1949 Geneva Convention provisions we'd stretched to classify their entire invasion as a crime against humanity, the 1970 UNESCO Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property we'd used to designate every alien artifact they'd touched as stolen cultural heritage subject to immediate forfeiture. "You had weapons," she said, smiling the same sharp smile she used to wear when she was a corporate lawyer suing oil companies for spilling crude into the Gulf. "Now you have a court date. And trust me, the judge is not going to go easy on you, not after what you did to the farmers in Peru." The envoy stared at her for a long minute, then slumped back in his seat, the fight draining out of him so fast I almost felt bad for him, until I thought of the footage of the Nigerian village their peacekeeping forces had burned to the ground last month, the kids who'd hid in the latrines while their homes burned, the refugee camp in Jordan where I'd spent 3 weeks last year handing out food to people who'd lost everything to these guys' so-called liberation. We weren't being cruel. We were just holding up a mirror to every ugly, cruel thing humanity had ever done to each other and letting them drown in the reflection. The intercom crackled to life, our orbital command's voice tight with barely suppressed amusement. "Command to negotiation team, fleet just tried to burn for Mars, our buoys fried their port thrusters, they're drifting. Also, their comms are begging for a reprieve on the food rations motion. Says their crew is down to 40% reserves." I looked at the envoy, who was now rubbing his temples like he had a migraine, and thought of my grandma again, the way she'd sit at her kitchen table for hours, filling out form after form to fight the city council when they tried to condemn her house for a highway. She'd always say that the most powerful weapon humanity ever invented wasn't the atom bomb, it was the paper trail. Turns out she was right. The aliens thought they were coming to conquer a planet. Instead, they got stuck in a paperwork nightmare so bad even the most sadistic 20th century bureaucrat would have pitied them. I picked up my pen, flipped to the page of the surrender agreement where we'd hidden a clause requiring them to fund reconstruction of every village they'd destroyed, plus a 10% administrative fee for our legal team's time, and set it down in front of the envoy. "Sign here," I said, nodding at the line. "If you don't, we file the motion tomorrow to classify your entire fleet as abandoned property under salvage law, and will be legally allowed to strip it for parts to pay for the damages you caused." "Your choice." He stared at the line for 10 full seconds, then signed, his claw dragging across the paper so hard it tore. Outside the chamber windows, the first streaks of dawn were starting to paint the sky pink, the first normal sunrise we'd had since the aliens showed up 6 months prior. No bombs had dropped, no one had died today, just ink and precedent and the long, slow wait of all humanity's worst mistakes finally used for something good. The envoy's claw still hovered over the torn paper, trembling like he wanted to rip the whole agreement apart, but he didn't. He knew better. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch, watching him stew in the realization that his empire had been undone not by weapons, but by clauses and precedents. The irony was delicious. These conquerors had studied our military history, our wars, our bombs, but they hadn't bothered to study our courts, our councils, our endless committees. That was their fatal mistake. When the door opened, a junior officer slipped in with a stack of new filings. I recognized the top one immediately, a petition from the International Criminal Tribunal, demanding the aliens submit to jurisdiction for crimes against humanity. I slid it across the table, the envoy's eyes narrowing as he read the first line. "Failure to comply," I said softly, "will result in your fleet being declared a criminal organization. That means no port, no trade, no recognition. You'll be ghosts in orbit, unable to land, unable to buy, unable to sell. You'll starve in silence." He hissed, a sound like metal scraping stone, but I didn't flinch. I thought of the old Cold War PSYOPs manuals I'd studied, the way entire governments had been destabilized with nothing more than rumors and forged memos. We didn't even need to forge anything here. Their own atrocities were enough. All we had to do was shine a light on them, and the weight of our bureaucracy did the rest. Outside, the sunrise had deepened into gold. I imagined the people in the villages, the camps, the cities, ordinary humans waking up, making tea, stretching, unaware that their survival today had been secured not by soldiers but by lawyers, archivists, and clerks. My grandma would have laughed herself hoarse if she'd lived to see this. She'd always said the pen was mightier than the sword, but she never imagined it could be mightier than an alien armada. The envoy finally pushed the paper back toward me, claws shaking. "We will comply," he muttered, voice low, broken. I nodded, not triumphant, just resolute, because this wasn't about victory, it was about precedent. About proving that humanity's darkest histories, the genocides, the tribunals, the endless bureaucratic nightmares, could be weaponized into something that protected us instead of destroying us. And for the first time in months, I let myself believe we might actually win this war without firing a single shot. The envoy's compliance was only the beginning. I knew better than to trust his words. Empires don't surrender with a single mutter. They stall, they maneuver, they look for loopholes. And loopholes were my battlefield. Every treaty, every tribunal, every obscure clause buried in the archives of Geneva or The Hague was a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. I had a team combing through centuries of dusty records, resurrecting forgotten precedents like ghosts summoned to haunt the invaders. One of my analysts unearthed a gem, a clause from the post-Nuremberg era that allowed for indefinite detention of organizations deemed stateless aggressors. The aliens had no recognized sovereignty, no seat at the UN, no charter. By our own laws, they were less than pirates. I drafted the motion overnight, and by morning, the envoy was staring at a document that stripped his fleet of any legal identity. Without identity, they couldn't negotiate, couldn't sign, couldn't even exist in the eyes of the international order. It was annihilation by paperwork. The brilliance of it was psychological. Their empire thrived on dominance, on the certainty of hierarchy. To be told they were nothing less than criminals, less than shadows, was a wound deeper than any missile strike. I watched the envoy's posture collapse, his claws twitching as though he wanted to tear the paper apart but knew that doing so would only confirm his impotence. He was trapped in a cage built not of steel, but of signatures and seals. Meanwhile, our network spread the narrative. Every broadcast, every leak, every whisper carried the same message. The aliens were criminals, fugitives, pariahs. Ports closed their doors, trade routes evaporated, even neutral states refused to acknowledge them. Their fleet became a drifting armada of beggars, unable to dock, unable to refuel, their supplies dwindling with each passing day. And the more they resisted, the deeper the bureaucracy tightened around them like vines choking a fallen giant. I thought of the old PSYOPs manuals again, the ones that spoke of breaking morale with nothing more than rumor. We didn't need rumor now. We had fact, law, and history. Humanity's darkest chapters, The tribunals, the sanctions, the endless bureaucratic strangulations were no longer shameful relics. They were weapons sharpened and aimed at an empire that had underestimated the power of paper. The envoy finally whispered, "You are monsters." I almost laughed. Monsters? No, we were clerks, lawyers, archivists, ordinary people wielding extraordinary history. And in that moment I realized the war was already won. Not with fire, not with blood, but with ink.